Hi everyone, it's Sasha Crotty, and I'm here to present on this year's What's New in the Revit API. I'm very excited because there are some big changes and some smaller ones, but hopefully, for the most part, things that you will be excited by. Um, with that, let me go ahead and dive in. The first thing I want to remind everybody of is that this is all futures, so we make no promises about actually delivering this functionality, but we try to give you the best insight into what's coming that we can. Please don't make purchasing decisions based on what you see here. With that, we usually split this presentation into two pieces. The first one is all about things that you have to do because they are breaking changes to our APIs as well as APIs that we've had to remove. So you will have to react to these. And then there are other pieces of functionality that more enhancements that I'll talk about in the second half of this presentation. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first thing that everybody needs to be aware of is that CF# is a library that is used by Revit. So at times, if the wrong version of CF# is loaded, that can cause instability in Revit. Because of that, we've actually forced load of the CF# library ahead of any kind of add-in initializations. So be aware that your add-ins with this version of Revit will need to use the same version as Revit. And that version is 92.0.260. We've also made a kind of a breaking shared parameter change. We have decided to deprecate the visible property on external definition creation options. The reason for this is that there is a better way of storing information. We didn't feel that this was something that should be part of shared parameters. So we do advise storing data in extensible storage instead of using a shared parameter and hiding it from users. The next area is the geometry API. And there's a couple of changes here. The first one is an updated description to bounding box XYZ. So we updated the description to be clear that the bounding box might not be empty even if a geometry property returns no geometry. The reason for that is because get bounding box doesn't take into consideration geometry properties options. So sometimes you might have an invisible geometry and that is not taken into account by bounding box XYZ. The other thing that you should know is that we've deprecated geometry instance element symbol, so you can go ahead and use this slightly longer version of getting the same information. Basically, get the symbol ID from the geometry instance and then call get element on it. We've also changed custom export a little bit. So we've deprecated a method called get symbol ID and replace, on group node, which is the base class for instance node and link node, and there are specific properties and types here for link node and instance node respectively to get that same symbol ID from them. In terms of STL export, there's a slight renaming of the enum in terms of export resolution. So it's just been renamed to remove STL, so a small update there, as well as kind of other methods that now take this new renamed enum as an input, as an argument. In terms of energy analysis, we have kind of clarified and simplified things. So in terms of energy analysis space, rather than using inner volume and analytical volume, please just use volume. And then in terms of the property area, it now works in more cases. So previously, it only worked for the mode use rooms or spaces. And represented the area enclosed by the interior bounding surfaces. It now actually supports other modes that includes use building elements and use conceptual massing and building elements. And these are then measured by the center planes of the walls and the top plane of roofs and floors. And then there's also a number of different deprecated APIs in terms of conceptual masses. I won't read these out to you, but just be aware that these are things that we've been tweaking and therefore have had to just clean up some of the APIs and make them a little bit more consistent. There's also a change to reinforcement. So reinforcement by default will now be actually shown as solid geometry where it wasn't before and you had to turn on that capability. Now when you just switch to fine detail level in a 3D view, it will just turn it on automatically. There is no replacement API because this functionality just works automatically now, kind of the way you'd want it to work and the way a lot of other Revit elements work. So that there are a number of deprecated APIs that really don't have a replacement because they are no longer needed. Then the other thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later in terms of enhancements, but we want to be aware that there are many, many classes in terms in the structure namespace that are associated with structural analytical models that have been completely overhauled. So these methods, because of the foundational changes of how the objects work, we've had to remove the methods immediately, so they're not even deprecated, so they're just gone in the upcoming version. Because it was, as it says right here, deprecation was not possible. And if you're interested in what all those classes and methods are, please take a look at the API documentation. It's just too long to list here, but it's very, very significant revamp in terms of our structural analytical model. And last but not least, in terms of things that are going away, all APIs that we previously had marked deprecated in Revit 2022 are out of here. So I hope you enjoy a little bit of my Aladdin humor. I've been watching it with my daughter recently. Okay, so switching over to enhancements, you'll notice that the new methods and properties and enums that we've included in the API are highlighted in blue in the upcoming slides. So if you're interested which part is new, which part is existing, and typically it's blue unless I've missed something. Let's go ahead and dive in. So the first area of new enhancements are schedules. One of the things that we can now get is the information about the heights of pieces of a schedule on the sheet. So that includes the schedule title, this column header, and each row of the schedule. So now you can actually understand how big the schedule will be on the sheet. This is important because we've actually added the ability to split schedules on sheets. And so there are a number of new methods, which I didn't actually list here, but there are a number of new methods in View Schedule that allow you to split schedules and manage how they're actually assembled on a sheet, including which pieces of a schedule end up on which sheet. And then last but not least, this is kind of an exciting functionality because it really changes the way that Revit works, is you can now filter a schedule by what is actually on the sheet. So now you can basically don't have to go through a bunch of manual steps to validate what's in a view and what, and how to make sure that those things are corresponding things are in a schedule. You can just simply say filter the schedule by the sheet and you will actually get the accurate information. Another area here is we've got enhancements to the work sharing API and specifically the ability to delete a work set. This has been a long time request, so excited to add this. The method to delete a work set takes in a delete work set settings class with a bunch of options that determine what to actually do with the elements in the work set. So in terms of geometry, we've got a few enhancements here as well. So the bounding box API now has the ability to check whether a bounding box is set for an object, whether you can expect it to be available or not. We've also got a little bit of enhancements to manage the geometry associated with a symbol element. And a symbol element, right, is the type element that's associated with multiple instances. So now we actually have access to a symbol geometry ID class, which identifies a single piece of geometry managed by a symbol element. And then it can be used to compare if two instances point to the same piece of geometry. So from that symbol geometry ID, you can get a unique identifier, and then you can also identify what the symbol ID is of the containing geometry that's shared. So this way you can actually start to match better whether two things are similar or not. In terms of direct shapes, we've got a small enhancement with access to the user assignability property, which basically identifies whether a direct shape can appear in the type drop-down selector in the Revit UI and whether a direct shape can actually have its type changed to a specific direct shape type. So this is basically an ability to control whether things are available and how much a user can actually change in the UI in order to switch direct shape from one type to another. We've got also a number of feature enhancements in terms of the way things work with Format. And it's very exciting because we actually have the ability to directly connect to Format and basically have a round trip process from going to Revit to Format and back to Revit. The other thing is we have been doing a lot of our import code in kind of a more generic manner. So a lot of the time when we fix something for one type, specifically an AXM file, we actually get the same benefits in others. But in this case, what we actually have now is the ability to control a format import using AXM import options. And then we actually have the ability to call import on AXM file from the document. We also now support importing of STL and OBJ imports and links. That same document import method now takes OBJ and STL options. Import instance also takes those as options, and document link also takes OBJ and STL. And then what we have is the same thing also for Shape Importer. So Shape Importer also considers those as valid options. So the cool thing is the technology we've been using in the background that allows us to do these imports is really starting to become more generic. So adding additional types becomes easier and easier for us. On the other side, export, we've also added OBJ export. So now document export supports OBJ export options. And then there are a number of configurations in there, including what are the units, edge length, etc., tessellation settings that allow you to control what that export looks like going out of Revit into OBJ. We've also got a few pretty cool View API enhancements. In particular, we have the ability to duplicate sheets and the control of what happens when you duplicate a specific sheet. So we have duplicate sheet option as a new class. You can basically just copy just the title block. You can copy the title block and the details. You can copy the title block, the details, the viewports, and the contained views, or you can do those with detailing, or you can do those as dependent views as well. So a lot of flexibility and a lot of automation possible that makes it much simpler rather than having to actually copy the views and then update all the documentation. And then view sheet has a new method that is called just duplicate that actually takes in this option and allows you to duplicate the sheets. And then we also have the ability for views to identify whether a view is placed on a sheet. So this placement on sheet status class indicates whether a view is placed on a sheet, and you can ask a view whether it has been placed on a sheet or not. And other news in views, we've also got the ability to transform from model space to view projection space. So a number of transform enhancements to get the transform, get the boundary, and then get all the model to project transforms from a view. We've also got the ability for transform from a view space to a sheet space. So this basically helps you understand how a view is related to a sheet, and do all of those conversions. And the powerful thing that this enables is that we've added new functionality to swap a view, in a viewport, one viewport for one sheet to for another view. And this capability happens in the UI as we actually place the views so that they're aligned to each other. And so that's why you have all these cool transform methods, but then it's also now possible to actually edit the view ID of a viewport. And it's also possible to control how view is positioned in that viewport. We've also got a number of enhancements to elements. So we certainly now make it a lot easier to parse a string and convert it to an element ID, and then also to try to convert it where it will fail rather than throw an exception. So you can kind of have two different options to understand whether it will be successfully parsed into element ID or not. You can also start to identify whether an element is modifiable. So in some context, for example, in edit mode, an element may not be editable because it is outside the edit scope. So now we have exposed this property that allows you to identify whether the element is currently modifiable. And then we've also got elements with multiple external resource references. So we now support material assets and decal images through external references. So this is really powerful functionality because it actually allows material assets and decal images to work with desktop connector and our docs software. So you can actually start to use those as references and store them in the cloud. And then we've also got the ability to identify whether a category is actually built in or not. When it comes to documents, we've got a pretty cool enhancement as well. You can now identify the elements that have changed between two different versions of a document. And this is not between like Revit 21 and 22. This is between two iterations of the same document in the same version. So you can actually now query the document for its specific version and then get a list of which elements have changed since the previous version. In terms of annotations, we now have a new enumeration called Leaders Presentation Mode. And this allows you to control which leaders and how they are presented. So that includes showing all leaders, hiding all of them, show only one, or you identify specific leaders that you want to show, as shown in this image. Independent tags also now have the ability to merge elbows, so you can actually start to get a slightly different presentation where, rather than having a bunch of completely independent leaders, we also have the ability to define whether a specific leader is visible, and set whether that leader is visible. In terms of slabs, there is now the ability to create a crease from a folding line. So basically you can pick the edge of a floor and convert them from one to the other. So sketches also have a number of new enhancements. In particular, in Sketch Edit Scope, we have the ability to start with a new sketch. This is needed because some elements, for example, walls, don't actually automatically start off with a sketch. So you need to add one first before you enter the sketch edit mode. So now we've added the ability to go ahead and do that. We also now added the ability to create dimensions inside of a sketch edit mode. So that includes document new dimension and document new family instances, which can now support creating something sketch edit mode. To do that, you can go ahead and enter a null for the view parameter, and use sketch entities as dimension references. The sketch entities being objects in the sketch. We didn't change the method signatures themselves, but we changed the descriptions to say that this is now possible. We've also got filled regions on a sketch plane. So you can go ahead and create a filled regions on a specified sketch plane in a 3D family. And then last but not least, we've got boundary validation for sketch elements. So you can determine whether a specific boundary is valid in a view. or if it is valid on a specific sketch plane. Additionally, we've got a couple of enhancements to Project Browser. The first one is exposure to the Project Browser organization types. So now you can actually start to control a type of Project Browser organization is set. Additionally, we have a new class called Project Browser Options, which now contains settings that control the project browser. So, and these settings, by the way, are stored in the Revit INI file, so they are per session and not something that can be controlled by project. And then so Project Browser Options now also has a property called Show View Placement on Sheet Status Icons. And what this property does is, as shown in the image on the right, you can start to see a visual indication of whether a view is placed on a sheet or not. So that this property just turns on and off that behavior. Next, we've got enhancements to selection. The first one is the ability to get and set references that are part of a selection. So this includes elements or sub-elements in either the host or a linked document, so you can actually specify what a selection contains. Next, then this is super exciting. We now have a selection changed event. I know a lot of people have been waiting for this and asking for it, so I'm excited to add this to our capabilities in the API. This required a significant rewrite internally, but we were able to achieve it. And then there's also associated event arguments that allows you to get the references and get the document of where that selection changed event happened. A small enhancement to parameters is whether you can identify if a parameter is a built-in parameter or not. Another enhancement to the print API. So this is another exciting capability that we've provided in the UI, but we also have an API equivalent. View sheet set can now support an ordered view sheet list. So basically you can specify in what order those sheets and views will print. You can set that view sheet set to printing automatically, and then if you do that, you can either print the sheets in browser organization order or sheet number order. Alternatively, you can set it to an ordered view list and specify the exact order of views and sheets. In terms of energy analysis, a couple of enhancements. The volume property is able to return the volume of an energy analysis space. So if you're using the mode use rooms or spaces, that actually represents the volume measured by the interior bounding surfaces of that space. However, alternatively, it's actually the average of the analytical volume, which is measured at the center planes of walls and the top plane of roofs and floors, and the voxel volume, which is defined as the number of enclosed unit cubes. Basically, you can start to get that calculation no matter how you're setting your mode. You can also start to get the poly loops of an analytical surface. So this is basically a collection of planar poly loops that describe the surface and opening geometry of an analytical surface. It's basically done in the way it is described in GBXML, and currently it's measured at the analytical geometry, so centerline geometry. In terms of MEP, a few enhancements. The first one is the ability to change the host reference of a connector. So now you can basically say whether a connector moves along a plane or a plane plus an edge. We also have the ability to access the domain data of a spatial element. So this is a new base class that allows specific domain requirements to be set. Specifically, in this case, you can start to get things like electrical load area. And then you get this domain data class by calling getSpatialElementDomainData on spatial elements. And then another small enhancement for fabrication parts, the ability to flip a fabrication part to be oriented in the opposite direction. So this applies to T's, crosses, valves, dampers, etc. and it does its best to maintain existing connections and not break them when that object is flipped. So on the electrical front, we've got about 2 pages of enhancements, and by the way, most of these classes represent a bunch of other methods and properties that are available underneath these. So just be aware that this is just a high-level summary of everything that's been added. Quite a long list here. So the first thing here is the ability to lock the state of a circuit slot at a specific cell in a panel schedule, so a small enhancement there. Additionally, we've got a new class for electrical analytical nodes. This class allows the identification of the node and connection to other nodes, both upstream and downstream. And additionally, you can access the total load and analytical property data for that node. We've also got a new class for analytical bus data, which represents the data and parameters of an analytical bus node. That means you can start to access the rating, the voltage, and total current of the analytical bus. We've also got data for an analytical distribution node, which represents kind of the data and parameters of an electrical analytical node. We've also got analytical equipment load data, which enables the access to electrical parent load, power factor, true load, load classification, and load type of analytical equipment loads. Additionally, we have area-based load type. So there's kind of a number of enhancements around area-based loading. So this is kind of the type that starts to enable access to power density, load classification, load density, and power factor. We've also got area-based load data. And you use this to add and modify electrical load areas used by an area-based load, and it enables access to a number of properties of an area-based load. Further, we've got a number of other additional data types, so including electrical load area, area-based load boundary lines, analytical transfer switches, and analytical power source data. So basically very kind of similar behavior, enabling access to different properties for different data types in the electrical analytical space. Additionally, we've got a few enhancements to the mechanical area. So that includes the ability to access domain data for a zone element. Basically, that allows you to do domain-specific requirements for a zone, as well as taking a zone and creating an area-based load for that zone. I mentioned earlier that we had a number of enhancements to structural analytical modeling, and the reason for this is because we really refactored to make analytical structural elements a primary way of working. So previously they were derived from the physical elements. Now you can start to model them independently, which allows more of an engineering persona to work directly in Revit. So really powerful capabilities, and really starts to bring our analytical modeling to the next level where you can truly work parametrically with an analytical model directly in Revit. So in addition to all the APIs associated with what we just saw in the video, we also have some additional APIs for structural loads. So that includes the creation and checking of validity for line loads, area loads, and point loads. So not only modeling the analytical representation, but also making sure to model the loads so that that data can be taken directly to structural analysis. On the reinforcement front, we have enhancements to rebar propagation. So there's a new class that is a utility that makes it a lot easier to copy rebar from one shape to another. So there's one method that is called align by host that basically takes the rebars and aligns and adapts them to the destination host. And then there's align by face, which copies the source bars, aligns them to a specific face, and then adapts them to the destination host. Then we've got one additional enhancement method in Rebar host data. It's called is reference contained by a valid host, and that identifies whether an element that contains the reference can host reinforcement at all. So certainly helpful, in terms when you need to determine whether something can actually be moved to a host. And then one other enhancement for reinforcement for a rebar coupler, you can now get the rotation angle of the coupler around its axis. And then one thing to note on reinforcement, this isn't strictly in Revit, but I do want to mention it because I know that there have been a number of people who have been modeling reinforcement in Revit who really care about this. We have done a significant revamp of how we do rebar and how we extract it for viewing in the Forge viewer. So you can start to see that we've gotten huge performance gains in terms of the time it takes to view reinforcement in the docs viewer. So, and the both the Forge viewer and the docs viewer. So very exciting here. I know that this has been a long time ask. So for future Revit versions, we've made big impact here. And then I mentioned that we usually do two sections. I did actually add something here on the end that I want to make sure that we address a few projects that don't necessarily have APIs that are reflected in this version, but I did want to mention them because they will impact the future way that we work, and I wanted everybody on this call to be aware of them. So the first thing of note is additional taggable categories. So there are a number of different categories that are now taggable. So this is kind of a small change, but we wanted to make sure that things in Revit are consistently taggable. So if you're kind of building any automations and tags, just be aware that there's a bunch of new categories that are available for this. In a kind of different way of looking at things, one big area that we are focusing on is kind of helping people to standardize their data and improve the data management. And with that, we've been working on a project called Unified Parameters. And the goal here is really to start to move parameter definitions into the cloud so that rather than three personas working together with shared parameter files and ending up with completely incompatible data at the end, if we start to move those definitions to the cloud, then when that data is combined, you actually get a holistic representation of the project. So this is something that we are looking to launch. It's, like I said, it's not going to have APIs immediately, but it is something that is future consideration. If you're interested in this, please do reach out to us. We really appreciate it. We'd love to get your feedback as we start to build out APIs for this functionality. And then last but not least, I wanted to make you aware of Forge data exchanges. So we've spent quite a bit of time this year implementing and opening up Revit data in a way that makes it available to multiple systems. So what we do is we take Revit, we open it up, making it available in Exchange, and that Exchange can be consumed in Inventor, and the same Exchange can actually be consumed in Power Automate. So this is kind of our own implementation into a third-party ecosystem, but the great thing about Power Automate is it allows a lot of flexibility and access to that data and all those other apps that Power Automate connects to. But the really cool thing is we are taking this data, making it available in an open form so that you can really take it anywhere you want. Again, something that is not necessarily available immediately as an API at the time of this release, but it is something to be aware of. And if you're interested here, we'd certainly love to hear from you because there's probably opportunities for us to test APIs going forward. With that, I do want to thank you for taking the time to watch this today, and I hope to see you at the Q&A session in the near future. Thank you. Take care.